The photograph fell from between the pages of an old recipe book, landing face up on the dusty kitchen table with a soft whisper. Eleanor Whitmore paused in her sorting of her grandmother's belongings, drawn to the sepia-toned image that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly light, despite the overcast afternoon filtering through the cottage windows. The photograph showed a group of people standing before a house she recognized immediately, this very cottage, though it appeared somehow more vibrant in the image, as if the years had drained the color and life from it. But it was the young woman standing slightly apart from the group that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. The resemblance was uncanny: same auburn hair, the same sharp cheekbones, the same questioning eyes that stared back at her from mirrors. Yet the photograph bore a careful inscription in faded ink: Millbrook Village, September 1947. Eleanor turned the photograph over, her fingers trembling slightly. In her grandmother's familiar handwriting were the words, "Margaret's last day, the rain will come again." Below that, in different ink and a shakier hand, "Eleanor must know." Margaret. The name sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the September weather. Her grandmother had mentioned Margaret only once, years ago when Eleanor was barely 16, describing her as the sister who went away, with such finality that Eleanor had never dared ask again. Now, staring at this impossible image of a woman who could have been her twin, she felt the weight of family secrets pressing down upon her like the gathering storm clouds outside. The funeral had been small, attended only by Eleanor and a handful of elderly villagers who spoke in hushed tones about Grandmother Whitmore's long vigil finally being over. Eleanor had inherited the cottage and its contents, though she'd never understood why her grandmother had lived in such isolation. Miles from the nearest town, and accessible only by a winding dirt road that seemed to discourage visitors. Now, 3 days after the burial, Eleanor found herself reluctant to return to her London flat. Something about the cottage called to her, a pull she couldn't quite name. The building was solid and well-maintained despite its age, with thick stone walls and small windows that seemed designed to keep something out rather than let light in. Every room was filled with carefully preserved furniture and belongings, as if her grandmother had been maintaining a museum rather than a home. The village of Millbrook itself was peculiar. Despite being only 2 hours from London, it seemed trapped in an earlier century. The few residents she'd encountered during her brief forays for supplies had been polite but distant, their conversations dying when she approached, their eyes following her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Mrs. Pemberton from the corner shop had been particularly unsettling, her gnarled fingers clutching Eleanor's change as she whispered, "You've got the look of her, you have. Your grandmother." She kept the watch for so long. But the 27th year comes round again soon. "What happens in the 27th year?" Eleanor had asked, but Mrs. Pemberton had simply shaken her head and turned away, muttering something about the rain and keeping doors locked. That first night alone in the cottage, Eleanor had tried to dismiss the villagers' strange behavior as rural superstition. She'd made herself a simple dinner and settled by the fireplace with a book, listening to the wind picking up outside. The cottage felt different in the darkness, larger somehow, with shadows that seemed to shift independently of the flickering flames. She'd gone to bed early, telling herself that grief and the unfamiliar environment were making her imagination overactive. It was the storm that woke her. Rain lashed against the windows with unexpected fury, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like the footsteps of giants. Eleanor lay in her grandmother's old bed, listening to the house creak and settle around her. Then, the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, pressing against her eyes like a physical weight. She fumbled for the torch she'd placed on the bedside table, clicking it on to reveal the familiar outlines of the bedroom. Nothing seemed amiss. Yet the silence between thunderclaps felt pregnant with anticipation. Then she heard them footsteps on the floor above. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. The cottage was only 2 stories, and she was sleeping in the upper bedroom. There was nothing above her but the attic, accessible only by a ladder she'd noticed folded against the hallway wall. Yet the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth directly overhead. She crept from the bed, torch in hand, and made her way to the hallway. The footsteps had stopped, but now she could hear something elsey, soft scratching sound, as if someone were dragging fingernails across wood. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the walls themselves. At the end of the hallway hung an old mirror, its silver backing spotted with age. As Eleanor's torchlight swept across it, she caught a glimpse of movement, not her own reflection, but another face entirely. The face from the photograph, pale and translucent, mouth moving as if trying to speak words that couldn't cross the barrier between glass and reality. Eleanor stumbled backward, the torch beam wavering wildly. When she steadied it on the mirror again, only her own frightened reflection stared back, but she could swear she felt eyes watching her from somewhere beyond the glass. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind an oppressive humidity that clung to everything. Eleanor might have convinced herself the previous night had been a dream, if not for the muddy footprints she found on the attic, floor footprints that were distinctly feminine and far too small to be her own. She spent the day exploring the cottage more thoroughly, seeking answers to questions she was only beginning to formulate. In the cellar, behind a stack of preserving jars, she discovered an old trunk secured with a rusty padlock. The key hung on a nail nearby, as if her grandmother had wanted it to be found. Inside the trunk, beneath layers of moth-eaten blankets, Eleanor found treasures that made her hands shake, bundles of letters tied with ribbon, more photographs, and most importantly, a leather-bound journal filled with her grandmother's careful script. The first entry was dated September 15th, 1947, just days before the photograph had been taken. "Margaret is growing weaker," the entry began. "The dreams come every night now, and she speaks of voices calling her to the forest. Mother refuses to acknowledge what we all know, that the 27th year has come round again, and the shadow in the rain grows hungry. The old protections are failing. Margaret bears the mark, as her grandmother did before her, and her grandmother before that. Back and back it goes, to the first settlement, to the bargain struck in desperation." Eleanor's hands trembled as she turned the pages. The entries grew more frantic, describing strange occurrences in the village livestock, found drained of blood, children reporting nightmares of being called into the forest, mirrors that showed faces of the dead. And always her grandmother returned to Margaret and the approaching day of rain. September 20, Twund, 1947. Margaret has not eaten in 3 days. She stands at her window, staring into the forest, and when I ask what she sees, she says only, "They're waiting for me to come home." I have searched Mother's old books and found references to the ritual, to the price that must be paid every 27 years. One life to hold back the shadow, one willing soul to stand guard at the threshold. But Margaret is not willing. She fights it, and her resistance is tearing the veil thinner. The journal's tone shifted dramatically in the entries that followed. Her grandmother wrote of consulting with the village elders, of ancient books that spoke of boundaries between worlds and the things that waited in the spaces between. Most chilling of all were the descriptions of previous offerings, young women who had vanished into the forest during storms, their disappearances explained away as accidents or running off with lovers. September 26, 1947. Tonight is the night. The rain has begun, and Margaret has stopped fighting. She came to me this morning, her eyes clear for the first time in weeks, and said she understood what must be done. "Tell them I went willingly," she said. "Tell them I chose to protect rather than to flee. I have prepared the ritual circle as the books instructed. Mother has taken the photograph," she says. "There must be a record, a remembrance. By tomorrow it will be over, and the village will be safe for another 27 years. The final entry was written in a different hand, shakier and clearly added years later, 1974. "The dreams have begun again, not for me, but for my daughter. The shadow remembers, and the blood calls to blood. I have hidden her away, sent her to London, where the old powers cannot reach. But there will be another daughter, or a daughter's daughter, and the circle will complete itself. The village will demand its due." Eleanor closed the journal, her mind reeling. 1947 plus 27 years was 1974. Another 27 years would bring them to 2001, then 2028. But 2001 had passed without incident, as had 2028. She quickly calculated if the cycle held true, the next date would be. She grabbed a pencil and paper, working out the math with growing horror. Today was September 24th, 2055. In 3 days, it would be the 27th of September exactly, 108 years since Margaret's disappearance, marking the completion of 4 cycles. A knock at the cottage door interrupted her calculations. Eleanor opened it to find a man about her own age, with kind eyes and a concerned expression. He was soaked through despite the lack of rain, and his boots were caked with forest mud. "I'm James Hartwell," he said, extending a hand. "I live just down the lane. I wanted to check on you, make sure you're settling in all right." Eleanor invited him in for tea, grateful for normal human company after the morning's revelations. James seemed refreshingly ordinary. He worked as a writer, had moved to Millbrook for the peace and quiet, and knew little of the village's history beyond general folklore. As they talked, Eleanor found herself relaxing for the first time since her arrival. "The villagers are a bit odd, aren't they?" James said with a rueful smile. "Always muttering about the weather and looking at the calendar as if it might bite them. I've been here 2 years, and I still don't understand half of what they're on about." Eleanor hesitated, then decided to confide in him. She showed him the photograph and shared some of what she'd learned from the journal, watching his expression shift from skepticism to concerned interest. "You don't believe any of it, do you?" she asked. James was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph. "I believe your grandmother believed it," he said finally. "And I believe something strange happens in this village every few decades. I've done some research of my own local newspaper archives, census records. The pattern of disappearances is consistent." They spent the rest of the day going through the journal together, James asking thoughtful questions and helping Eleanor piece together the timeline. As evening approached, he offered to stay, clearly reluctant to leave her alone with her newfound knowledge. "I should go," he said as the sun set, but he made no move toward the door. "Stay," Eleanor said impulsively. "I could use the company." That night, they fell asleep on the sofas in the sitting room, the journal and photograph spread between them on the coffee table. Eleanor woke to find James gone and his sofa empty, though she could have sworn she'd heard him breathing beside her just moments before. She searched the cottage frantically, calling his name, but found no trace of him, except for his jacket hanging on the back of a Cherar jacket that was soaking wet despite the dry night. In the pocket, she found a handful of hair that was definitely not his own, dark where his was fair, and far too long to have come from a man's head. Eleanor ran to the window, staring out at the forest that pressed close to the cottage's back garden. The trees seemed different in the morning, light closer, more menacing, their branches reaching toward the house like grasping fingers. She was certain she could see movement among the shadows, shapes that might have been human, if not for the way they flowed between the tree trunks. Over the next 2 days, time seemed to accelerate and distort. Eleanor would look at the clock to find hours had passed in what felt like minutes, or discover that she'd been standing motionless for what seemed like hours, only to find that mere minutes had elapsed. The cottage itself began to change. Furniture rearranged itself when she wasn't looking. Doors opened and closed on their own, and the mirrors throughout the house showed increasingly disturbing reflections. The photograph was changing too. Each time Eleanor looked at it, another face had faded from the group, as if the people were slowly being erased from history. Only Margaret's image remained clear, her eyes seeming to track Eleanor's movements across the room. The clocks in the cottage began running backward, their hands spinning in reverse, as if time itself were unraveling. Shadows moved independently of their sources, sliding across walls and floors in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The journal's pages ruffled constantly, as if stirred by an unfelt wind, always falling open to the same passage. The blood calls to blood, and the shadow remembers. On the morning of September 27th, Eleanor woke to find the cottage transformed. Every surface was covered with photographs, dozens of them, all showing the same forest clearing at different times throughout the decades. In each image, a young woman stood at the center of what appeared to be a circle of standing stones, though Eleanor was certain no such circle existed in the local forest. The women's faces were different, but they all shared certain features: the auburn hair, the questioning eyes, the sharp cheekbones that Eleanor recognized from her own mirror. The rain began at noon, not the gentle drizzle typical of English autumn, but a torrential downpour that seemed to fall upward as much as down, creating impossible patterns against the windows. The sound it made was wrong not, The familiar patter of water on glass, but something that resembled whispering voices, as if the rain itself were trying to communicate. Eleanor knew she couldn't wait any longer. Armed with a journal and a torch, she ventured into the forest, following a path that hadn't been there the day before. The trees closed around her like a living tunnel, their branches weaving together overhead to block out the stormy sky. The path led inexorably deeper, past markers carved into tree trunk symbols that matched those sketched in her grandmother's journal. She found the clearing exactly as it had appeared in the photographs, though the standing stones were not stones at all, but something far older and more disturbing. They were trees, but trees that had been shaped and twisted into unnatural forms, their bark worn smooth by decades of rain and carved with symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. At the center of the circle lay a flat stone altar, its surface stained dark with what could only be blood. Upon the altar sat an open book, its pages fluttering despite the still air beneath the canopy of twisted trees. Eleanor approached slowly, her torch beam dancing across the incomprehensible text within. As she drew closer, the truth of the ritual became clear. This was not about sacrifice in the traditional sense, it was about replacement. Every 27 years, when the barrier between worlds grew thin, something tried to cross over from whatever realm lay beyond the forest. Only the presence of a guardian, someone bound to the place by blood and willing sacrifice, could hold it back. Margaret had not died here in 1947, she had become something else, a sentinel standing watch at the threshold between worlds. The women in the photographs had all made the same choice, generation after generation, becoming part of the forest's defense against an ancient hunger that waited in the spaces between reality. But Eleanor could see that the system was failing. The guardians were growing weaker with each cycle, their sacrifice less effective as the modern world encroached upon the old boundaries. The thing in the forest had learned patience, had found ways to corrupt the ritual from within. James's disappearance had not been random, had been taken as leverage, a way to force Eleanor's hand. She could feel eyes watching her from the darkness between the trees, and gradually, figures began to emerge from the shadows. They were the missing women, but not as they had been in life. They moved with fluid grace, their forms seeming to shift between human and something altogether more primal. Margaret stepped forward from among them, her face bearing the same features Eleanor had seen in the photograph, but marked now by decades of otherworldly existence. "You understand now," Margaret said, her voice carrying the sound of wind through leaves. "The choice that faces every daughter of our line. To hold the door closed, or to let what waits beyond finally claim what it has always sought." "What does it want?" Eleanor asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "To be," Margaret replied simply, "to exist in your world as it has never been able to exist in its own. It offers power, promises of immortality, whispers of knowledge beyond human comprehension, but its nature is hunger, and your world would become nothing more than prey." Eleanor looked around the circle of transformed women, seeing in their faces the weight of centuries of sacrifice. "There has to be another way," she said. "Some method that doesn't require an endless cycle of guardians." Margaret's expression softened with something that might have been hope. "There is," she admitted. "But the cost. The ritual can be reversed, the boundary sealed permanently. But it requires not just one life, but the willing sacrifice of all who have served as guardians. We would finally be able to rest. But you would have to make the choice for all of us." Eleanor understood. To break the cycle permanently would mean destroying the network of guardians that held the barrier in place, replacing it with something far more absolute. She would not become a sentinel like the others, she would become part of the boundary itself, her essence woven into the fabric that separated the worlds. But there was another option, one that Margaret had not mentioned but that Eleanor could see clearly in the other woman's eyes. She could refuse entirely, could walk away and let the barrier finally fail. The consequences would be catastrophic, but they would be consequences for the world at large, not just for her family line. Or she could try to find a middle path, some way to strengthen the existing system without perpetuating it indefinitely. The journal had mentioned other methods, older rituals that predated the Guardian system. They were more dangerous, with no guarantee of success, but they offered the possibility of freedom without apocalyptic consequences. As Eleanor weighed her options, the rain intensified, and she became aware of something vast and hungry pressing against the boundaries of reality. Through the gaps between the twisted trees, she caught glimpses of movement shapes that defied description, geometries that hurt to perceive directly. The thing that waited beyond was ancient beyond measure, and its patience was finally at an end. "Choose quickly," Margaret warned. "The barrier weakens with every moment you delay." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of generations pressing down upon her. When she opened them again, her decision was made. She stepped forward to the altar, placing her hands on the open book. The text became readable the moment her skin touched the pages, revealing the true ritual in all its terrible complexity. She began to speak the words written there, her voice growing stronger with each syllable. The twisted trees began to straighten, their bark healing and their leaves returning to natural colors. The circle of guardian women grew brighter, their forms becoming more solid and human with each word Eleanor spoke. But this was not the ritual of replacement or the ritual of permanent sealing. This was something else, entirely a ritual of binding that would tie the guardian network directly to the natural cycles of the world itself. No longer would individual women be required to sacrifice their humanity. Instead, the barrier would be maintained by the collective will of all who lived within its influence. The price was different but no less significant. Eleanor would indeed become part of the boundary, but not as a lone sentinel. She would be the focal point of a web that connected every resident of Millbrook to the forest's defense, sharing the burden among many rather than placing it on the shoulders of one. As the ritual reached its climax, Eleanor felt herself changing. Her consciousness expanded, touching the minds of everyone in the village. She could sense their dreams, their fears, their hidden strengths. Mrs. Pemberton's whispered warnings had been born not of superstition, but of genuine knowledge passed down through generations. The villagers had always known, had always been part of the defense, even if they hadn't understood their role. The thing beyond the barrier raged against this new configuration, but its influence was diffused now, spread across dozens of minds rather than focused on a single guardian. It retreated back into whatever realm it had come from, stymied for the first time in centuries. Eleanor felt her physical form becoming insubstantial, but she did not disappear entirely. Instead, she became something between human and spirit, able to move between the cottage and the forest, between the world of the living and the realm of the guardians. The other women, Margaret and all the rest, were finally free to move on. Their long vigil ended. James emerged from the shadows, where he had been held, confused but unharmed. Eleanor was able to speak with him, to explain what had happened and what would happen next. He would remember, but the trauma of his captivity would fade like a dream upon waking. Years passed, though Eleanor's perception of time had changed fundamentally. She watched over Millbrook as its unofficial guardian, no longer bound to the rigid cycle of the ritual, but free to adapt the village's defenses to changing circumstances. The residents continued their lives, most unaware of the subtle ways they contributed to keeping the barrier strong. Occasionally, visitors would come to the village and find it strangely peaceful, as if some nameless tension that existed everywhere else in the world had been lifted here. They would stay longer than planned, reluctant to leave, though they could never quite explain why. Eleanor maintained the cottage as a kind of way station, a place where those sensitive to the supernatural could find rest and understanding. She was not alone. James had chosen to stay, becoming something of a chronicler of the village's hidden history. Their relationship had changed but not ended, evolving into something that transcended the normal boundaries of human connection. On quiet evenings, they would sit by the fireplace and discuss the delicate balance that kept the world safe from ancient hungers. Eleanor had access now to knowledge that spanned centuries, understanding the true scope of the forces that pressed against reality's edges. Millbrook was not unique. There were other places, other guardians, other communities that served as bulwarks against the dark. But perhaps most importantly, Eleanor had learned that the cycle of sacrifice could be broken without abandoning responsibility. The old ways had their place, but they need not be the only ways. Innovation and tradition could work together, creating something stronger than either could achieve alone. One autumn afternoon, 27 years after Eleanor's transformation, a young woman arrived at the cottage. She bore a striking resemblance to Eleanor herself, and carried with her an old photograph she had found among her grandmother's belongings. The photograph showed a village scene, and in the background, barely visible but unmistakably present, stood Eleanor's figure watching from the shadows. Eleanor smiled as she welcomed her visitor, ready to share the true story of Millbrook and the choices that had shaped its destiny. The cycle was broken, but the story continued, each generation adding new chapters to the ongoing tale of humanity's quiet heroism in the face of unknowable darkness. In the end, Eleanor had discovered the greatest victory was not in defeating the monsters that lurked beyond the boundaries of the world, but in finding ways to protect what mattered without losing one's own soul in the process. The photograph that had started her journey now served as a reminder not of sacrifice and loss, but of transformation and the endless possibility for hope, even in the darkest of circumstances.